Simon, ich teste noch mal ganz kurz, okay, das Teilen. Du kannst, oder willst du schon reinlassen? Bist du auf stumm?
Danke. Die Leute sind schon da.
Ah, okay, dann machen wir es so. Jetzt sehe ich es. Sehr schön. Mhm.
All right. Welcome everyone to ECBA's first talk in this series, Global Goals, Local Impact, Sustainably Ever After. I'm really happy to welcome all of you this evening and that Sybille Zavala is taking her time to introduce to us the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive from the EU that will hopefully alter biodiversity, amongst others, to the better for all of us. And my boss, Harm Smit from the Netherlands, wants to say a few words to you as well.
Yes, I'm very pleased to be here. And this is a dream come true. For a long time, we were looking to connect biologists in Europe. And now finally we have this webinar series. And perhaps you can go to the next slide, Nicolas. Yes, because we don't want to spend too much time on this. But I think one of the main things we have to do is that we have to show, we have to be proud to be a biologist. I think we don't do that enough. And by not being proud of ourselves, we deny society the ability to reap the benefits of biology. So it's not only for yourself, it's also for the society. You have to be proud of what you do and reach out to the public. So, and the reason for that is because we have only one planet. We have no planet B. So we also have responsibilities due to our knowledge. So even though we're proud to be a biologist, we often are proud but not happy to be a biologist because we are able to oversee what is happening in our world and how this is progressing to the future. So for me personally, it's a great pleasure and honor to be here, to be able to talk to you. And I gladly deliver the floor to Sibylle for giving a lecture on the real nitty-gritty of this problem.
Thank you, Harm. And I would like to take a moment just to also introduce properly Sibylle to all of us. Sibylle studied biology at the LMU in Munich with a focus on climate change ecology. She then followed up with a Master of Science and also a diploma in engineering in a master course that was called Environmental Planning and Engineering Ecology at the Technical University in Munich. She's also a scientific diver where she had a lot of experience. Amongst others, she also worked for an Institute for Water and Soil Pollution Control, an environmental consultant at the Bavarian Parliament. She was a senior consultant and managing director of a climate consultant company, and that is, I think, what you're currently also doing. And going through your profile, I was really astonished where you actually did all your work. You volunteered, you did all kinds of networking also in the whole climate change business. And Sibylle has put her knowledge into practice in 5 languages on 4 continents and under 3 bars water pressure. And with this, I'm happy to hear you talk now, and we'll hand over. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Sibylle, for taking the time, and I hope we all enjoy this talk. Just a few technicalities while Sibylle is setting up her slides for us. Now you should be able to do that. We will use the Q&A function of Zoom and to collect all of your questions that arise during Sybille's talk. You can, while the talk is going on, you can type in your questions. If you find a question that you're interested as well, please like that question so we will prioritize your question or this question in the very end. You can also use the chat for any thanks or other comments, and I will activate the chat in a moment. And with this, I hand over now finally.
Thank you very much, Simon. Thank you, Harm. And anybody just give me a heads up if you can see the slides properly. Perfect. Thank you. Well, yes, so the topic today, it has a very long name and title. It's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive. As a biologist 15 years ago, I would have never thought that I would end up doing things like this. And that's why I'm so happy to be here today and to talk to you about the nexus between biology as we learn it in school from primary to postdoctorate fellowships, and then going into the labor market from, as Simon said, from politics to being in research and now in consultancy for companies. So I will start right away with one slide telling about why we show companies where I work now, what we do, why we do this. And let me just say one more thing about the context to biology. Well, when I studied, I thought, okay, we'll see if I'm going to be a white biologist, so in a laboratory, or green. And now I think I became a maybe gray biologist working at an office. But there are many good reasons for sustainable business practices. You probably know all of them, and also the initial situation of climate change is most probably consensus here. So I won't go into it very far, but I want to show you that we have two sides of the coin and two ways to see why we should and why the CSRD was brought into life. So we know extreme weather events will increase. We know that resource scarcity will happen more, rising raw material prices, and all of this will lead to the Earth's temperature to rise and maybe up to 3%. So that should be the intrinsic motivation of every person that works at a company to do something about it. But there are also other incentives, negative as positive. So negatives one are, for example, CO2 prices, CO2 budgets. I know the one from Germany must be used up, have been used up last year already, and we still have a lot to go. It should be similar in other European countries. And then there are lots of other political regulations we will talk about today. The positive incentives, of course, also subsidies. For companies, this slide, the right part, I show to my clients, and I think it's interesting for you to see it here for why for companies it makes sense. So it is a growth driver, meaning that climate protection as a corporate goal promotes resilience, and it will reduce risk in supply chains. The business activities impacted by climate change will be strengthened at an early phase, hopefully, and we'll see in the next couple of slides that the reputation is important for companies now, that customers want more greener, more environmental friendly products or companies. And since subsidies are high, relatively high now, and will become less, and the negative incentives such as CO2 taxes and so on will increase, the differentiation now is a large advantage. Also, one thing that I have seen in the last couple of years in my experience is that a greener corporate culture, talking about CO2, talking about biodiversity, is very important as employer branding, especially for well-educated employees. They really want to work for companies whose values they represent and can be combined with long-term climate and nature protection. So this identification, this commitment reaches customers, business partners, residents, communities, employees, and that atmosphere is very important for companies. So to make it even clearer, it's not only positive in the way I told before, but it actually pays off financially as well. So on the right side, you see two graphs where the environment plays an increasingly important role in purchasing decisions, and then the sales of selected green products, which go up. So we have seen that there are new, potentially fast-growing sales markets that arise from the use of advanced climate solutions along the value chain of they meet the demand for climate compatible products and services. And also what we have seen, what I see at my job actually, is that companies need investments, and they get them from third parties, of the granting of loans, of financial decisions. These are actually being linked towards the company's own climate impact or their goals. So that's one very important thing. And then one thing that's very clear is that increased efficiency, here I'm talking more about energy efficiency, reduces costs and emissions. And so that makes it possible to have more revenue. And this is a financially very important incentive for companies. So at this stage, when I talk to clients, they should be convinced to take action towards biodiversity, towards nature and climate protection in general. We will talk about one directive, but I do want to show you the best known, the most widespread context we have of conventions, of laws on the left side, and of ratings and reporting. So they're very theoretical approaches. On the one side, we have the CSRD. We have also corporate social responsibility, corporate citizenship, sustainable supply chain management, green procurement. There are lots of international conventions, and on the European level. Then, in which the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive is one we'll be talking about today. Then there are standards for reporting coming from CDP, the Climate Disclosure Project. GRI is the Global Reporting Initiative. And then there are ratings, which are very important for B2B, so business to business, or to end consumers. And EcoVadis is one very important one you might have heard of. Then there are standards for management systems. There are standards for assessing sustainability, performance, and so on. So the only thing I want to show you here is that the political pressure on sustainability as a holistic issue has multiplied in recent years, and that the market requirements are also becoming more and more extensive. In the past, companies discussed new laws probably just with the legal department and worked through a checklist, basically. Now companies are really forced to reflect their own procurement processes, their supply chains, their suppliers, and sometimes even question their business models. So this is the big picture I want to talk to you about. And one thing we don't see here, but is in the background, as I said before, is that financial institutions adjust the interest rates, for example, according to the fulfillment of the so-called ESG criteria. I will explain that in a second. So this is very hard and complex for companies to work with. But fortunately, most of companies I talk to now recognize not only the urgent need for action because they have to be compliant with these laws, but they see the opportunities that come with it. And I see the opportunities for biologists that come with it. So let's start with the Corporate Social Responsibility Directive. What is it in general? In general, it aims to help investors, civil society organizations, consumers, so all stakeholders, to evaluate the sustainability performance of a company. This is a very huge thing if you think about it. It is part of the European Green Deal, and as I said before, this is what I said about ESG, meaning environmental, social, and governance matters. So this ranges from climate change, from CO2 emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, towards diversity, security for employees, up until human rights and gender diversity, so age diversity, all of these things. So it's very, very broad. It integrates in a digital reporting. It needs to be accessible. And this means that it also has to go through an auditor. The timeline is that it's actually starting this year, so from the financial year 2025, but companies have to start collecting data 2024 up until 2028 for large companies, and we will later see why basically all companies, also small and medium ones, are affected from this. The expectation we have are very, very high. We expect that the practices among businesses will be more robust sustainability matter, will be easily and transparent, and it will be accessible to understand what needs to be done, and hence facilitate decision-making by the executive boards and by other stakeholders. So what does ESG stand for? The environmental part we talked about now, climate change in general, but that's meaning adaptation, mitigation, CO2 emissions, energy consumption, and so on. All environmental pollution. Here we talk about water resources, freshwater resources, salt water, marine water, and here also biodiversity lies within. All other resources, raw materials used, and circular economy. The social part talks about the employees in this value chain. So that's all from suppliers until the consumers. And all companies are not in a vacuum space, but in a community that's also a stakeholder. And then consumers if it's a service, or products and users. Governance is a part of the administration and culture of a company, and even broader, a board, a committee. So this means how companies have incentives for their CEOs, their CTOs, there's basically all levels of hierarchies, how much effort and importance they put into sustainability. Here we look into the corporate values, into the corporate goals, corruption, political interference, how they partner up in the market. So sustainability is not anymore only about ecological matters, but it is a very holistic thing, and this makes it for the CSRD even harder and very, very complex. So you see here we will be talking about biodiversity and a little bit more about climate change, but as you can see, it's a very small part of the entire CSRD. This slide I do want to show to you because when introducing the webinar, it was talked about companies in general, and the idea of the European Green Deal, the way, let me just go back so you don't have to see this. Yes, the idea of most European regulations is that it is compulsory for large companies that have actually the means to do so, to drive change, and then through the value chain, smaller companies are also affected directly or indirectly. So this is very important because when we're talking about the large companies that you see here that are going to be affected first, that's already around 50,000 companies in Europe, and then you have many more. I think it's about 90% of all companies are small and medium enterprises, SMEs. You see that basically every company needs to report on this. And why is that so? It is because large companies need to report through their entire value chain. So they need to ask their suppliers about their impacts on biodiversity, about their positive impacts, negative impacts, about their potential impacts within years. And the large companies actually need to sanction suppliers if they don't report, or if their reports show a negative impact, and can actually have to terminate relationships and basically not buy from them anymore. So and the above part, you see, this is the CSRD, but then there are also other directives where information comes from. So there are other guidelines, and all of these will come into force gradually and are already now affecting companies throughout Europe. So the learning until here should be that sustainability and biodiversity, for that matter, is not a nice to have anymore for companies, but it is really essential to survive and to thrive in a European market. All right, so now I would like to go a bit more into detail of the corporate sustainability reporting directive. It will be led in taking the sustainability, the ESRS as a basis. That's the European Sustainability Reporting Standard. And that actually relies on and is based on the other standards I showed you before. So this means it is not something new that has been created, but it is similar to how companies have been reporting. Maybe that's also important to say at this point, that it's not the first time that companies report on biodiversity, but it is the first time that all large companies have to, and that they have to do this in a standardized way. So the ESRS, the reporting standard, is actually not finished yet. This makes it quite hard for companies, for the large companies that need to report starting next year, and actually already started in January to collect data, because they don't know yet exactly how to collect their data. But next year we'll have to report on that. Depending on the company size, the amounts of data are very, very different. So for small companies, often it's enough to basically have Excel sheets with and try to find out what impacts they have. We will talk about examples soon. But with larger companies, you can imagine if they have dependencies in several countries and suppliers from all over the world, which is the usual case, it has very strong depth, and it's a large amount of information across the value chain that needs to be managed, and it needs to be renewed every year. So this is one important thing that complicates it a lot. As shown before, it is not one alone standing directive, but there are other guidelines. There is the EU taxonomy, which is also very interesting for biologists, because it shows how much percentage, so which part of the company's business practice is green and what percentage is not. And here also already financial institutions, banks, take this into account to calculate interest or give or not give loans to companies. This one, the EU taxonomy and the EU Supply Chain Act, also ask for information, and it's a bit of a double. So it is very, very smart for companies to have a very straightforward data collection and not to do everything every year again. We involve usually auditors in an early stage so that we make sure, especially now that the ESRS is not finalized yet, we want auditors to come into the process of large companies to make sure that they go along with the process, how companies collect data on biodiversity or on other issues, and don't ask questions that we won't be able to answer at the end. Right, so you would ask yourselves now, how do companies know what to report on? Biodiversity is a very large, very big word. Where do you start and where do you end? And this is done by a principle called double materiality. That is new, and it means the following. It means that you have two impact ways. You have one inside-out way, which is the one that we usually think of, meaning what is the company's impact on ESG, meaning in sustainability, matters of environment, social, and governance. And then we have the financial materiality, the outside in, meaning how do these matters of sustainability actually affect the company? I think this makes it easier if we talk about an example. So let's consider a multinational company involved in agriculture. The inside-out perspective would be that its operation include land use for crop cultivation, and that leads to habitat conversion, fragmentation, and can lead to loss of biodiversity, right? Including the destruction of natural habitats or decline of native species populations. This is, I think, an example pretty clear. The inside-out perspective would be that the same company faces risks associated with biodiversity loss or the degradation that can affect its operations, its supply chain resilience, meaning that it doesn't get the raw materials it needs, and also reputation, for example. I want to say this because we're usually thinking only, especially us biologists, about the environmental part, but we do need to look at social and governance, right? And after this, we will talk about what can they do about it. But here, I first want to talk about this double materiality. I do want to make one other example that is less obvious. So let's consider a global fashion retailer as an example. There, the inside-out perspective would be the raw materials such as cotton, wool, leather from various regions worldwide to produce clothing or other accessories. And the inside-out perspective here is that intensive farming practices for cotton, for example, or grazing wool can contribute to habitat destruction, maybe to soil degradation, water pollution, the textile dyeing, probably finishing processes can release pollutants into ecosystems, further affecting biodiversity in water bodies. And you see that the supply chain and value chain grows, and also the area that can be affected. The outside-in perspective for the fashion retailer is that it is also exposed to risks arising from biodiversity loss. For example, also the disruption of raw materials due to climate-related weather events, or you have higher costs and you can't buy that leather anymore. And then also talking about S and G, you can have negative publicity or regarding biodiversity related issues, and those can damage the company's brand image or market position. So after you make this double materiality assessment, you know what impacts you have and what impacts ESG has on you. And that's what these are topics that you're asked to in a checklist you need to dig into and report about. So how do we get there? How do we implement the CSRD? The basics here are that we need to have an overview of the stakeholders. This means whose opinions, whose expectations do I need to take into account and determine the future of the company. So here, the first thing would be suppliers, right? And consumers. But then also I have investors, I have NGOs, maybe environmental organizations in the countries that I buy the raw materials from. There are the regulators and the government. Then local communities being affected by polluted water, for example. Maybe an industry association that represent fashion or textile sector. They shape industry norms, they shape the standards, they shape best practices. And then also we have the media and public opinion. So you see, just looking into which stakeholders I have, it is again a world and one very, very large thing. And the CSRD asks companies to make a stakeholder assessment. This means that all stakeholders have to be taken into account. All stakeholders have to be asked their opinion. And this is only able to do through a ESG team, meaning team that can be in smaller companies, maybe just one person, usually the person that is in procurement, or it can be a sustainability manager in a company. Ideally, the background comes from various departments. Here, this is a part where biologists with knowledge about biodiversity implications are important, and they gather the knowledge from internal processes and are then the interface to partners, partners and to the executive board, meaning the responsibles for a company, and these need to open the doors for sustainability projects and provide the financial resources and, of course, the human resources, which we have seen. I want to note this right here, that this is the job announcements in positions for biologists or people with a biological background in natural sciences, for positions such as sustainability managers or other positions in ESG teams and companies are increasing very, very rapidly. So here, just to have the overview again, what every part of these essentials mean. We don't need to talk through all of them, but I did want to give you an overview. So the most important here are the stakeholders, the ESG team, and then the executive board. Right, so before we look in detail into what the CSRD asks in terms of biodiversity, I want to show you this slide to show that it is an iterative process due to several reasons. So the complexity of biodiversity impacts is very high, and it is in every other topic regarding ESG, regarding environment. So if you can talk about climate change adaptation, we can talk about water resources. It counts for all that stakeholder expectations may change, right? So once we have a first report, once we have a transparency, this evolves and it drives increasing awareness about environmental issues, and stakeholders may demand more comprehensive and more meaningful reporting over time. And when, for example, with this fashion retailer example, when he needs to engage with stakeholders, gather their feedback, then he will adjust its reporting approach to meet their evolving expectations. And then all topics in the CSRD they're not merely about the compliance, but it is more about driving a continuous improvement in the actual performance on biodiversity topics. So this means that the report is only a tool to identify the areas of action, to set targets, and then to track progress over time. And an iterative reporting enables a company to learn from the first experiences, the first action steps they took, and then implement corrective actions if something didn't go the way it should have, and also demonstrate progress, right, towards biodiversity conservation goals, and then with that, do also marketing in a positive way. And at the end, the idea would be that it's integrated in a business strategy. So effective biodiversity reporting requires an integration with the company's overall strategy, with the overall risk process, with the sustainability objectives. So the reportings will need to align to these changes as well. We have 3 steps here. So the first one is basically a stock analysis, stock survey, the stakeholder, as we talked about already, and then we see fields of action and start to prioritize. Afterwards, we collect the data, and ideally, before collecting data, we set a plan and define the departments, and then gather and measure very specifically. And in the third part, we evaluate the results, we evaluate the impacts on biodiversity that my company has, and I report on it. And as I've talked earlier, we integrate the learnings. And this will happen year after year. So having talked about the overview of the CSRD, what it means, where it comes from, how a company walks the first miles to understand the whole process about the double materiality. Then we have the actual CSRD. Well, not actual because it's a draft still, but we're pretty sure that this is what we're going to be working with in the next couple of years. And so you see the drafts here, they are divided in different chapters, and the most important one here in the part of environment, climate change, pollution, water and marine resources, biodiversity and ecosystems, and then the resource use and circular economy. I want to give you some examples because biodiversity also affects climate change and the other way around. So a company in this part discloses how it sets target to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and how it will address related risks to it. This is risk and opportunities as well. It's not only risk. So also this means, for example, renewable energy deployment, energy efficiency, mitigation of climate change risks in a supply chain. Very often these are the weather events or raw materials prices, and in countries, there are charts and there are graphs and there are statistics which countries are most affected, and also transition risks in supply chains. So this is a very broad topic. I wanted to still write down a couple of measures that are possible for companies to take so that you get a feeling of what, at the end, what comes around with this. The first thing is most often for companies to calculate CO2 footprints. And when I talk about CO2 here, I always mean CO2 equivalents, which are all greenhouse gases named by the Kyoto Protocol. I think there are 7, but but being calculated together in CO2 equivalents. And with a CO2 footprint, what we mean is that everything that causes greenhouse gas emissions is measured. So either by burning gas for heat, or by buying energy, or by driving company cars, all the way to the products being produced in other countries and then transported to a factory, and then from the factory being transported to a shop, for example. It's a very, very large topic, only the calculation of a footprint. And after having calculated the footprint, this could be, just to name a number, for a small company, could be around 300 tons of CO2 equivalents per year. Then from here, companies can define climate targets annually, or until 2030, or long-term until 2050, meaning to reduce a certain percentage of emissions every year, and also absolute numbers, so how many tons should be reduced. This can only happen with a reduction plan. The most easiest way is to switch to green electricity, for example. Those are very easy first steps to take, but then it goes all the way until the optimization of products, the packaging, the transportation. It's a huge catalog of measures to actually reduce climate change or to mitigate climate change. And here, first, in a CO2 footprint, it is quite easily separated from biodiversity. But once you look into measures that go broader than just the company factory, and you go into your suppliers, then immediately you are faced with biodiversity issues. So now here we talk more specifically about the mitigation, about how to decarbonize. And here you take measures from the catalog I've talked before. And a company in this part must describe very clearly expected decarbonization levers and their overall quantitative contribution to the reduction targets. So usually, as said, that's the energy efficiency, the material efficiency, the consumption reduction, or renewable energy phase outs, or maybe even the replacement of products and processes. So it is usually the last thing to do, but it has been necessary. And this is also because of the EU taxonomy I talked about, that if a company has 90% of their products not being compatible with a green practices, then it will become hard for them to get subsidies, to get loans from European governments. One more I want to show you before examples on biodiversity, because water marine resources are also within aquatic ecosystems. And the most clearly here, the biggest is the water consumption. So a company needs to disclose its entire water cycle. Basically, it's the total water consumption, of course, but then also specifically in areas with high water stress, the amount of water stored, the amount of water treated, the amount of water discharged. And the water quality needs to be measured, the water quantity in local river basins. They need to also show how the data was compiled. This is very important to make sure that people that read the reports can actually make sure it is true and can track the information. So they need, besides showing how the data was compiled, they also need to show the methodology of calculation, assumptions used maybe. This is all for all topics being disclosed. They need to show if any information was modeled or was derived from direct measurements. So you can get a feeling that this is something very scientific and that there are industry-specific factors that can be used, which sources did they come from. It is not only about giving a total recycled and reused water in cubic meters, but it really needs to be assessed in on a large scale. So you here listening to this are not affected in a sense, or at least I hope, I assume most of you are not, but you can imagine that when I talk to companies about this, that some of them get really scared and then really wish that they have biologists in their team to help them navigate through this. So in the ecosystem and biodiversity, what needs to be done? What are companies asked for? First of all, the disclosure of biodiversity impacts, those that includes activities that may harm biodiversity or ecosystems. They need to identify biodiversity risks. So that means biodiversity conservation risks, ecosystem services within their operations, supply chains, and products, all of it. They need to measure how they can mitigate biodiversity risks, such as habitat restoration, conservation projects, sustainable sourcing practices. After this, they need to integrate it into strategy and into decision-making. So the risk management process, frameworks of a company, and for this, they need to engage stakeholders. So as I showed before, companies are really expected to include local communities, to include NGOs, to include experts, and understand biodiversity related concerns, and from there develop appropriate responses. All of this needs to be reported transparently, and the biodiversity performance needs to be shown. So all initiatives, all targets are crucial here. And the progress against the targets needs to be shown, the effectiveness of biodiversity conservation measures. As you can imagine here, that's also a thing. How do you measure that? There are several different ways of doing this. There are several that you can either do it with your own ESG team, or you will have to hire another company or hire biologists to do this. Most of people that work in an industry, with the example of the fashion retailer, but it can be really anything, have no qualifications to do this. It has to be outsourced. So what do they first do? They do biodiversity impact assessment, and then think about their metrics and their indicators. Yeah, what are we going to use? How are we going to quantify biodiversity risk? How are we going to quantify biodiversity opportunities from the projects we want to do? How are we going to measure ecosystem health? Maybe companies think of doing ecological footprint calculations, or of their company operations. You can see that by tracking all these indicators over time, companies, if they do it properly, they can really assess their progress in managing biodiversity impacts. But it is not a simple thing. And here, just to highlight some first measures that can be taken. let's see, we talked about this in the previous slide, the risk analysis, but then changes in, for example, structural, functional biodiversity of an ecosystem, when measures on habitats of endangered species. You probably have better examples than I have here, but some are habitat permeability based on physical features or arrangement of habitat areas. This could be either on the area, on the premises of companies, or in other areas. And then land recycling, brownfield sites, logistic areas, which are usually used very, very little for biodiversity, but have a huge potential. And then pollutants, of course, up until demolition planning, remediation of contaminated sites. All of these are very, very clear examples of first measures that can be taken for increasing biodiversity. So I hope to have given you with this first insight on how the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive affects companies, large companies in Europe, affects small and medium enterprises. And I am really, really interested in hearing your questions and in discussing it with you, and how this will be taken into classrooms, and how this could be a topic to discuss on how biologists will shape the future of enterprises in Europe. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sibylle. That was a really good overview, and I'm looking forward to any questions that might arise. And I also took some notes, and in the meantime, maybe I can ask a question or two. There's also first thanks in the chat. Just as a so the ESG certificates that companies nowadays get already, you know, when investing in ETFs or something like this, you know, how critical do you see the current certificates and how they are being monitored by any officials, let's say?
Yes. Here I am, just needed
Yes.
to get the micro.
All right.
So did I get it right? Are we talking about certificates for mostly climate neutral?
I mean, there are
companies?
already, for example, there are already ETFs that you can invest as a private investor that are ESG certificate. They have ESG certificates, the ones that you were mentioning in the very beginning. So you can, the MSCI World Index that is, you know, with a low carbon footprint and all these the things that you were mentioning in the beginning about the ESG. They have certain certificates, and these are handed out by, you know, also private-owned companies. And, you know, do you have an idea how the European officials might also intervene in these certificates, or do you know anything about this?
Yes, I do, because I work for a company that actually offered climate neutral company certificates, and then I stopped. And this is so there are several certificates, and as you say, Simon, there are many of them are given by private companies, so they're not standardized, and basically everybody can write their own certificate and sell it to other companies, and without being really clear on how they calculate it, and climate neutral compared to what, climate neutral based on just compensation, which happens with a lot of certificates. And maybe for other listeners that are not too familiar with it, what happens often is that footprints, biodiversity, ecological CO2 footprints are calculated, and then a number comes out, as I said before, for example, 350 tons CO2, and you pay a fee per ton put into projects that foster climate change mitigation, and then can claim climate neutral, but you have changed nothing or very little on your business practice. So yes, it is very, very much criticized, and yes, there are being steps taken from the regulatory side as well. So there is a anti-greenwashing law, that's the name of it. It's not passed yet through the parliament, but it is there currently, which will mean that companies need to report on how they calculated and how they claim anything, either climate neutral or even climate friendly, and they have to show scientific methodology behind it. They have to show studies, they have to show where they're putting, how they're compensating or how they're reducing. And so this is to protect, on the one side, to protect consumers from being greenwashed, from buying or being manipulated into buying green products, but it also actually is a measure to help companies that actually take measures but just don't talk about it that loudly as others do, or that maybe are not climate neutral because they actually just reduced a little percentage by actually having a different design on their packaging or whatever, actually reduces the amount of CO2 gases, or also now talking about biodiversity, and that's not being seen. So just to wrap that up, yes, it should be criticized, and there are laws on the way, and also the companies are being aware, and consumers are more aware that climate neutral does not equal climate neutral. So that just being honest with targets and the status quo often is better for companies than claiming that they are already doing too much.
Okay. And so the CSRD is just, going back to my previous question. So but it's another kind of law that is being introduced. This is not the CSRD which is doing that. These are just new standards.
Correct. The CSRD is the standard for reporting for large companies, whilst a certificate any company can put as a stamp on their product or as an email signature or company website.
But it might arise from the CSRD that, those certificates, it's sometimes that, Western countries or especially the EU, they set new standards, and then, certificates are being basically adjusted to be able to still, for companies to work in those countries or to have their products being sold there.
Yes, the bias is still there, and such monsters as a CSRD, and I mean monster just in the sense of the amount of paperwork that's going to be there for companies. Of course, companies look for something much easier, maybe as a certificate, and they can do, but they need to make sure that it is honest and transparent for consumers to find out what the certificate really means. And for that, there are other laws coming.
Okay, thank you. So there's one question in the chat, and this is something that I wanted to talk about anyway. So I think we also have a kind of a generation gap. There are not enough ecologists, especially, in Germany at least, that, could also do all this work that might come up soon. So the question is, I'm just reading out loud here. The person in the chat is saying, I'm about to graduate this year. What are the key qualifications looked for in a sustainability consultant? As an ecologist, I feel my education was not so focused on the numbers. Any recommendations on online courses to get deeper into this fresh field of biodiversity and or CO2 calculations?
That's a very, very interesting question. I'm really happy that it's been brought up because it looks so far away, right? I mean, I'm also an ecologist, and it looks so far away from what I'm doing now. But I do want to say out loud again that all that you're learning now is very important, and it doesn't need to be in a bachelor's and master's degree. There's no necessity to understand how CO2 calculation works. What I have seen in my experience and what I've been asked for in companies is that there's this overview that we have as biologists, as ecologists, from all ecosystems. We have a lot of physics and chemistry and a little bit of math and statistics. So we have such a big overview of everything that is what needed. And then afterwards, you will be able. It will be easy to understand how CO2 calculations work. I wouldn't now like to name certain courses, but you can reach out to me via LinkedIn, and I will be happy to share with you what I've looked into. One really good thing is the greenhouse gas protocol, the GHGP, and that is the international standard for calculation of CO2, for example. It is that's the basis, but we just rely on that. What you're learning now in ecology will be covering all that we've talked to now, from water resources over climate change, adaptation and mitigation, and biodiversity loss, ecosystems, all of that. No one ever that will be a sustainability manager that didn't have biology background will be able to learn afterwards, you see? So the other way around is possible for you. And there's lots of ways of learning it also on the way. That's more or less how I did it the last 10 years, and I got to be as a managing director of this startup company with that knowledge in the background. So I'm sure you'll make it.
Maybe one or two tips for the first steps. You know, this is something that graduate students always ask me when we're doing the with Phobio the orientation, like the professional orientation seminars. They usually ask for like what could be my first steps.
First steps, okay. First steps to become sustainability manager would be to look into companies that either you identify with and that are already strong in sustainability practices, or companies that need help and that you might not identify with the end product, but it is so big that it is worth to be in the process. And the positions, the first position, I think it's very open. I wouldn't suggest to look for one specific thing. I would suggest to be open to learn about all important parts. So that means if you're good in statistics, then stay in the part of CO2 calculation, for example, or the data procurement for the CSRD. If you're good in seeing the big picture, then you could get into a team that writes the report, that gets the data and puts it into sentences. If you can go into the communication part. So, but maybe go one step back. So doing internships in companies is always a great way of looking into and deciding whether you want to stay or not without a huge investment of time and effort, and there are more and more well-paid internships, because this position of sustainability managers there's just a lack of people who can actually do it. You will see, just one more thing, you will see on LinkedIn, on Xing, on other social media platforms like this, that there are a lot of people that claim to be sustainability consultants, but they come from a completely different background, which of course, a lot of them probably will have earned the knowledge in some way, but this is the good thing about biologists, that it is very clear why we have the means to be sustainability consultants, managers in an ESG team. So to be proud of that. And this coming back to what Harm said at the beginning, that when I studied biology 15 years ago, it was more of a question, will I ever be able to get a job as a biologist, or will I have to do something else? And now we can really own it, and I'm so happy that it has become mainstream, and that it's not something to hide, but it's the opposite. It's to show, well, I can actually solve a lot of issues that companies or the private sector has, and that companies are really looking for that.
Okay. Can I ask you a question? Because I've been biting my fingers off for information. And one of the things we see here, because we have a wide audience, and I always see the classroom as a way to communicate to society in general. And I can imagine that if you talk about sustainability and ESRD and all these goals, that the easy to understand ones are use of energy and sustainable resources, stuff like that. That's an easy thing. But to move from a company to biodiversity requires some more imagination, which is often not there in the society. So how would you suggest we address these things for the to talk to the general public as a biologist? Because we don't have to explain stuff to each other. We know what we talk about. For us, it's clear. But for those people out there, and you will meet them, because seeing this, I can imagine you have met quite some really panicking companies about what came towards them. And I would suggest their first step was to mitigate the idea and say biodiversity, oh, that's not such a problem, and all those tactics. So what would be our counter strategy we as biologists can put into the classroom and to society to support this initiative?
That's a big question.
Yes.
Well, how to put it into the classrooms, I think, as you said, we don't have to explain it to ourselves. And I think that in classrooms, that's an easier game to play and to explain. I would suggest, or that's how I learned the best, talking about ecosystem services, right? Which means that you monetize what nature does for you. That can be criticized as well, but just a way to put it in the capitalist system that we live in is a good way to actually put it on the table and to see what is not seen, what is behind all the calculations we usually have. How to put it on society is a more complicated thing, because I'm sure that's also what you've been seeing, is that it's not so immediate, right? So energy costs are high, and if you reduce those, then you just reduce your costs, and you don't have to be a very intrinsic motivated nature protector to see that's common sense. When it comes to greenhouse gas emissions, it's a little bit more complicated, but it's also quite short-term revenue that you can get subsidies, you can get and then you have a broader picture. They talk about CO2 as climate change in general. It has the same problem with biodiversity, in my opinion, that it is so far away, and it is not something that you can put your finger to. And with biodiversity, what I do when I talk to companies is to make it more immediate and to make it more clear what are the exact risks for them and the exact opportunities, and then start with low-hanging fruits. So this means the direct risks are that the raw materials you get will be more costly, or that value chains will break down or have broken down, and sometimes they don't even see it because they can buy it from another supplier short term. But to show some numbers, what biodiversity risks mean, and then on the other side show some positive parts. And one thing that plays us in our hands is that people, the consumers, the society wants it green, right? That's also a human instinct. And so if you have more nicer area in your company and more plants and pollinators, then that has the company has a higher value in that sense. Another thing, and then you start with these low-hanging fruits and make it, either you can call it employer branding, you can call it long-term target, you can call it just to actually meet regulations, but always try to make it very, very short-term related. I would hope not to have to put it like that, but in my experience, it is, since it is the only way to for society, I'm more talking about companies, not society in general, to actually do something, because they have financial years and not financial decades, right? So that is how the private sector works, and we have to adapt to that.
Okay. Do we have time for one more question? Because I think so. Simon?
Yeah, sorry, I was just going. I was on a search for someone commented, which I think is a nice comment, as a comment to the question about how to communicate the importance of biodiversity. The Potsdam Institute for Climate Change Research has published a paper called 10 Must Knows of Biodiversity Science. Highly recommended. I was looking for it just now, but I will put it in the chat afterwards. There's one more question. Coming back to the regulation, are there any laws, regulations, etc., that need to be taken into account when you build up the CSRD reporting strategy for a company from scratch? If yes, which ones would be the most important ones?
Okay, yeah, I'm seeing the question now. Well, so the law that lies above the CSRD is the European Green Deal, and then there are laws that overlap. That is the EU taxonomy and the CSRD. That's the supply chain directive. These are laws, but then the standard, which I would suggest if you want to look into this for a company from scratch, then look into GRI. That's the Global Reporting Initiative, and that is a standard. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it must be more than 10 years for the reporting on ESG in general, and that is very clear on what needs to be reported. So it divides into potential impacts, into actual negative impact, actual positive impacts, and just ideas on what to do with all the impacts and on plans, and gives just a very good framework to report.
Okay,
nice. Yes. What is the main strategy to counter this initiative, apart from the EU changing its stance on we have pesticides and stuff lately? But what do you see as a counter? How do companies counter this requirement? Because there has to be a narrative they use to go against it.
I'm not sure I understand your question. To go against it, you mean how I think it can be mastered?
Yeah, how can you if I'm a company and I want to make profit and if I pollute, I say I don't care because I don't like being bitten by mosquitoes, so less mosquitoes is better. So if I have such a stance, I will look for a strategy to counter this whole initiative.
Well, okay, got it. To start with, to put it in a more positive way, and with no, I mean not the. I mean the positive way is that there are companies that maybe do want to do something, but they don't have the means. So just one step or another kind of companies. These would take the first step of telling, well, I don't have the data and I don't have a plan because maybe I don't have the human resources, financial resources to make a plan. And this will be okay for the first year. And so companies that don't have any interest actually in taking action, then they will probably take this loophole and say we don't have the data and we don't have a plan. So the EU regulation gives 1 year. It might stretch it, but after a period of time, companies will have to come up with a plan, come up with action steps, and come up with targets, and then in the following year assess those targets. And if they don't, then there will be fines, and those fines are sadly not, as far as I know, currently in the whole European Union the same. So, for example, France has put it into law already a couple of months ago, and the fines are going to be really, really high for companies if they don't meet all these requirements. I'm not sure how it's going to be in Germany and in other European countries, but that there will be fines, that is for sure. And one way of making sure that companies can take these loopholes is that this report needs to go through an audit, and it needs to be reported with the compulsory financial reporting of every company. So this reporting will be a part of the financial report every year, and which also goes through an audit for large companies. So it is now at the same level as the financial reports, and those get fined as well if they're not correct.
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I think there's no, I don't see any more questions now. And then I would like to thank Sibylle once more for taking the time and giving us this nice overview. And for everybody who came and joined the seminar, also be there 9th of April. We're going to have the next talk, but I saw already from the registry that you all signed up for our newsletter. I'm really happy about that. And with this, I wish you all a nice evening and see you next time. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye. Yeah.
Thank you very much. It was great to talk to you. Bye-bye.
Ciao.